Welcome to Episode 7 of the Jedi Temple Archives podcast.
There is more knowledge here than anywhere else in the galaxy. Only members of the Jedi Council are allowed access. Guarding the holocrons is one of the most important duties a Jedi can be given. Do you think you're up to the task?
Star Wars fans, and welcome to Episode 7 of the Jedi Temple Archives podcast. This is Rob, your host, and we are recording today on Monday, April 22nd of 2019. I'm joined once again by my co-host, Tom, who is one of the hosts of the Hyperion Adventures podcast, and I know that we've mentioned that numerous times on this show before, and I think, Tommy, you may be a little distracted today. It sounded like you got some good news regarding Star Wars Galaxy's Edge.
Very exciting news. We have our reservations. We'll be there opening weekend in Disneyland Resort. I'm very, very excited about that.
Well, we're all going to have to live vicariously through you. It's going to be a little later in the year before I can make it out there, so I'm looking forward to hearing all about it once you get a chance to experience that.
And we will be getting done with it, wrapping it up, and heading right into the studio to record our podcast and tell you all about it. And we're really excited about that, very much so.
I'm going to be very impressed if you can keep a train of thought going. I'm going to have to believe that that's going to be a pretty exciting day.
It will be, and if I ever keep a train of thought going, that's something to be said, because I have all sorts of trouble with that.
Well, welcome to the party. So, yeah. So for this episode, I think what we're going to do is we're going to jump into the Jedi Temple Archives, and we're going to take a look into the background of Sheev Palpatine, who was the Chancellor of the Republic and eventually became the Emperor of the First Galactic Empire, and was also known by his Sith name of Darth Sidious. So many of you are going to be familiar with him mainly from the movies, but there is a lot more to Sheev Palpatine and Darth Sidious, for that matter, that kind of comes out through other mediums. The comics, books, and some of this information is actually going to come from some of the legend stories, some of the stuff from the expanded universe. But in lieu of them having really released a ton of new material that's considered canon, we're still going to touch on that. And the primary reason I want to do that is because what you'll find as you kind of look at those legend stories is that they tend to try to keep the best parts of that and bring that back in as canon. And with the news that kind of came out with the teaser trailer that was released for the Rise of Skywalker, and the hint that Palpatine may be appearing in some way, shape, or form in that film, I think this is going to be kind of a perfect time to take a look at him and see how he may actually be returning in that film. So without further ado, Tom, I think if you're ready, we'll go ahead and dive right in.
Let's do it. He's a great character. I'm looking forward to getting into this.
He is. So prior to the events of the Phantom Menace, there's some information really to kind of point out regarding Sheev Palpatine. He was born to a wealthy and influential family on Naboo. And at the time of the Battle of Yavin, which is kind of how everything is gauged within the Star Wars universe, he was approximately 84 years old. So he was born 84 years prior to the Battle of Yavin. At some point during his teenage years, it's believed that he met and ultimately became the Sith apprentice to Darth Plagueis, who he mentioned in Revenge of the Sith as he was unveiling the fact that Plagueis had discovered the secret to extending and even creating life via his manipulation of midichlorians. And when he became Darth Plagueis' apprentice, obviously at that point he was given the name of Darth Sidious. Later, with the aid of Darth Plagueis, he became involved in politics and was eventually appointed the representative of the planet of Naboo, which is kind of where we find him at the beginning of the Phantom Menace. And at that point, he began serving on the Galactic Senate in that capacity. Also, in his role as the apprentice to Plagueis, Palpatine certainly was aware of the fact that, he had discovered the secret to prolonging life, and potentially even the ability to create it. But he did later admit that he was unable to learn the secret to doing so. And we're kind of led to believe via the films that's something that he had never achieved, although I think there's now some questions, certainly, as I mentioned before with that trailer, that he's either figured out a way to prolong his life or resurrect himself, or he's going to be appearing in some other capacity.
Yeah, I think that's pretty clear in one way, shape, or form. Maybe he's found a little loophole in the force-sensitive system there to kind of make his way, whether he's learned it all from Darth Plagueis the Wise or not. But I'm excited to find out what that all revolves around. And if it's really true, if this is a little bit of a memory around what we saw would look like the shell of the Death Star or whatever, it's going to be fascinating to find out once we get to December for sure.
Right. And we will get into that a little bit later in this show, in the sense that there is kind of a basis for the idea of a Sith being able to attach themselves to a particular place or an object after their death. Again, a lot of that is in Legends, and I'm sure, Tom, you're familiar with some of that. I know you were also one that kept up with the expanded universe when that came out. So again, we'll jump into that a little bit later, but there's certainly a basis within the Star Wars lore for ways that he could be reappearing in this upcoming film.
And we've seen since Lucasfilm has been taken over by Disney and they've changed what has been the expanded universe into Legends and what is now canon, that they've, you mentioned this a little bit ago, Rob, they're not afraid to venture into some of those legends and pull and pick and choose what they like and what they can use and move into different ways in their stories. Some of the more popular stuff, some of the stuff that they think fits within canon. So it will be interesting to see if any of these do come to fruition.
Yeah, and I'm actually very happy that they did that. My feeling with the expanded universe and the material that's now Legends is always that there was a lot of really good stories that they were telling there, and I certainly can understand the need for them to hit the reset button prior to Force Awakens. There were a number of key characters that were no longer around as a result of the storylines that took place, and they needed those characters in order to carry the story forward. But it is really a positive thing in my mind that they're able to kind of pull some of the really key items and some of the really key characters forward from those legend stories and put them back in canon.
Right. And some of the expanded universe stuff also got a little convoluted. It contradicted itself in some ways. Timelines were mixed up a little bit. So they really needed to kind of get a rein on that. And then they can kind of tell the story how they believe it and still have it out there. You can still read that stuff, still enjoy it, but just know it's not necessarily canon. It's a legend. It's still good stuff.
Yeah, and there's always a kernel of truth in every legend. So from the time of the Phantom Menace, the events of the Phantom Menace, and we won't really go in depth into any of the information from those films. There are a couple of points that we'll touch on, but the assumption is going to be that people listening are going to have seen those films, and I don't think we really need to beat them to death here. But during the period of time between the Phantom Menace and the Revenge of the Sith, there were some kind of key events that took place that Palpatine was involved in. And some of these were things that you had actually seen hints of in the films, but others were kind of going on behind the scenes, and you wouldn't really know about them unless you were reading some of the other materials or watching some of the animated series. Probably the most important thing to know about that time period is that really every major event in that period, be it the events of the Phantom Menace, the Clone Wars, everything really leading up to his coronation and being given the emergency powers and eventually taking over as emperor, he was manipulating not just one side of those events, but both sides. He was creating scenarios and manipulating both sides to achieve his ends. And it really highlights what a master strategist he was, but also a master manipulator.
Yeah, he was really the puppet master, pulling the strings on both ends of it, kind of with a different persona for both sides. One is, of course, Chancellor Palpatine, and originally Senator Palpatine, and then the other side is Darth Sidious. But then we also saw, and we've discussed this on our show, that many times he would have this plan going in motion, and he foresaw going one way, and then then something would happen and it would make it take a left turn or a right turn. But he was also a master of adaptation, to be able to shift with what happened around him and still create the eventual outcome that he desired.
Yeah, I think it actually was, you could certainly assume it's one of his Force abilities. I know that when Luke, during the events of The Empire Strikes Back, had placed himself deeply into the Force as he was doing his exercises with Yoda, and he was seeing that his friends were in Cloud City and in danger and in pain. And Yoda talked to him about the fact that always in motion is the future, hard to see. But Palpatine seemed to have a real knack for being able to kind of winnow out which probabilities were most likely and kind of have plans in place for those things. And like you said, even when he didn't have a plan, he always was able to turn that around to his advantage. And I think that's actually going to play a pretty big role. I'd be surprised if they don't leverage some of that in regards to whatever story they're going to tell within the Rise of Skywalker as far as Palpatine goes.
Yeah, it wouldn't shock me at all. I think it really plays a part into who he was as a character and who he may still currently be. We don't know as a character. Interesting.
One of the items that I did want to touch on that we have just recently discovered was something that was going on even before the events of Revenge of the Sith, and even some of the later animated series where these characters actually started to show up. But Palpatine, during this period of time after he'd kind of secured his position of power within the Republic as the Supreme Chancellor, and leading up to the founding of the Empire, had in secret started a foundation called the Inquisitorius, also known as the Order of the Inquisitors. And if you're curious who these particular Inquisitors would be, probably the most familiar to folks who are, regulars at the Disney parks would be the seventh sister that they had included in the Jedi training trials of the Temple, where the kids basically get a chance to face up against Darth Vader and some of the other members. And the seventh sister was brought in as one of those villains that you might face off against. But these were all Jedi who had fallen to the dark side at some point. I think we're led to believe that this was mostly something that was happening during the Clone Wars, and certainly anyone who's familiar with the Clone Wars would have seen a few Jedi turn to the dark side. But the Grand Inquisitor, who was the person that led up this particular organization, was actually one of the Jedi Temple guards who had fallen to the dark side. And then the other Inquisitors, we haven't really had all of them revealed to us who they were initially, but these were a group that Palpatine was grooming to be the hunters and eliminators of any Jedi who survived Order 66 when the time actually came for him to initiate that. So once again, he's always looking into the future, anticipating what his needs are going to be and planning now for things that are still yet to come.
Right. And always, even though there was always the rule of two with the Sith, there were always these branches out there on the dark side that they would kind of use to their advantage. Maybe they felt at one point they would earn enough respect, earn enough, appeal to be called up and be taken as the official apprentice. But either way, they were trying to fulfill their role on the dark side of the Force.
Yeah, and again, knowing Palpatine and Darth Sidious, his alter ego or alternate persona, again, manipulation was such a huge part of how he controlled those around him, and I'm sure that he was dangling those types of things in front of them. But for him, the distinction was always, the rule of two applied to just the Sith Lords, right? A master and an apprentice. And in his mind, these were never people who were going to be able to truly become full Sith. In most cases, they had been raised since infancy in the Jedi Order. And even with their fighting style, and I plan on doing an entire episode on the Inquisitors because it's a really interesting organization, but even the way they fought was very much based in their Jedi past, and they were very much defensive, and they kind of had to have it beaten into them to be more offensive in the way that they attacked, as opposed to a Sith who's literally going to just be channeling rage, hate, and fear into everything they do and be very aggressive.
Yeah, I think we would see that quite often if you watch the Clone Wars and a little bit of Rebels that they appeared in as well. That they often weren't the most boisterous, the most aggressive of the fighters out there. They were always around, they were always looming, but they were never really, you never really felt that they were the true threat when they were out there. But they were always a presence for sure.
Yeah. The other thing with Sheev Palpatine is that in his role as Darth Sidious, he felt like he needed to have that apprentice to carry on the Sith tradition in the event that anything were to happen and he were to fall. But he starts out with Darth Maul, who was very much a strong, aggressive, combat-oriented Sith. And we've talked about this in previous shows, both here and on Hyperion, that I don't know that Darth Maul was ever really expected to be a long-term solution. I think it was what he felt like he needed at that time. I think we're both in agreement that Maul died far sooner than he expected, or he thought that he died far sooner than expected. But, after that point, and once he had identified that Anakin Skywalker was kind of his long-term goal, he still moved on to Darth Tyrannus, or Count Dooku as he was more commonly known. And it really seemed like that entire period of time, it was just about what he needed at that time. He needed someone who was going to be able to run the Separatist. He needed someone who was going to be able to carry on that role as an apprentice. But again, I don't think that there was ever any commitment to him as a long-term plan, or that he ever really expected that he would take on that role as the true Lord of the Sith and, kill Sidious.
Yeah, I think if you look at both those two apprentices as you go through them, they were perfect for their time, which I know you've mostly stated so far. I mean, Darth Maul was this aggressive, violent fighter first, and that's kind of what he was looking for, Sidious, Palpatine, when he was originally trying to do this. They were trying to force this war to kind of move this thing in the right direction really early on and get him installed as the Chancellor. When that kind of failed and he thought that Maul had gone, in a way he did, but they thought he had gone. Then he needed something different. It was an adaptation to the attack process that they were going through, how they were going to make this happen. They needed to have all these systems rise up against the Republic. So they needed somebody who was more distinguished, more of a veteran, people that something that people would respect, someone who has some political flair to him. And that definitely was what Count Dooku had, and he may have not had the fighting skills of, say, Maul, but he was a talented fighter, but really talented in the political realm.
Yeah, and he had the connections with all of the banking guild and the mining guild, and had that background and the wealth and the power that was necessary in order for him to really be seen as a viable leader of the Separatist movement. I think had there not been someone like Count Dooku, Sidious would have been far more at risk of being found out with his plan.
Right, and he had the title. He is a count. I mean, come on. You're going to listen to the count when he comes.
The one thing that has kind of it's always been something that's been discussed, and I don't know that anyone has ever come to a final determination on this, but right at the end of Revenge of the Sith, you've got the situation where Anakin has been defeated by Obi-Wan. He's lying there on Mustafar, on death's doorstep. Palpatine shows up there. He's, determined that Anakin's at risk, or Darth Vader is in danger. He shows up. He takes Anakin, puts him in a life support capsule to take him back to Coruscant. And he needs time to, create a life support system in the armor that eventually is used to encase Darth Vader and allow him to carry on. But at the same time, you've got Padme, who has been taken by Obi-Wan and is in the process of giving birth to the twins. And as the medical droid says, all of her readings are fine, but we're still losing her. To me, it can really go one of two ways, and I lean towards Sidious primarily because as a manipulator, you can almost see it on his face when he tells Anakin that in his anger he killed her. It seems to me to be implied that during this period of time, he is actually siphoning off Padme's life force to keep Vader alive until he can be encased in that armor.
Yeah, I've heard you mention that before, and I mean, I guess I'd like to believe that more than I believe like she's just lost the will to live, because that always seemed very ridiculous to me and hard to believe from somebody who was supposed to be as strong as a queen, as a senator, as Padme Amidala. But it's really hard, especially considering that she wasn't out there with Palpatine, or at least didn't seem to know that there were children for Skywalker that would be born. It's hard for me to put those two things together. Now, maybe that'll come out eventually that is true. And I know you've read some things and seen some things where you think that that's a possibility. I just don't believe that necessary. I just know from the way George went through these prequels and where they scuffled a lot of times. And I think that he just wanted to steer on too much on the right side of everything is good. And it's like, well, this is so that the relationship is ended, so she doesn't want to even live anymore. It just doesn't make sense to me, but that's kind of what I kind of gauged out of it. But I do think it's an interesting theory for sure.
Yeah, to me, Sidious seems to be very confident in the fact that she has died. And I don't think that it's too much of a risk to him for her to remain alive after he has trapped Anakin into becoming Darth Vader. It's certainly possible with Anakin and Padme and their connection and their relationship that it could have been Anakin in his pain and fear and anger that he somehow inadvertently caused her death. But it's just something about the way that Palpatine looks at him as he's telling him and kind of gauging his reaction and watching the rage as he, crushes the medical droid and rips off the restraints and pulls himself up from the table that he had been worked on.
It could also have been that he didn't really know, but he was saying this, that he believed this, and that either way, Padme was going to have to go into hiding, and he would find somebody to go hunt her down and kill her. And as far as Anakin, as Darth Vader would have known, she would have been gone.
True. Yeah, it's always interesting to me. It's just one of those areas of the films that never really gets directly addressed. I know that there's all kinds of theories out there. I'm just like you. I have a hard time believing it's anything as simple as, dying of a broken heart. Yeah. She always seemed like she was made of sterner stuff than that. So
I would hope so anyway. But again, we've also saw her fall in love with a person who shot out many, many red flags, as we talked about in our last episode when we looked at Attack of the Clones. Right. So many red flags out there that, maybe George just didn't see that part of it and just said, this is the easiest way to do this without having there be, so many, that Anakin killed her, or, I guess it's not as simple as dying in childbirth, which would have been an easy way to go on with it too.
Right. Completely agree. So after the events of the Revenge of the Sith, and we kind of move on to that period of time after the foundation of the First Galactic Empire, Sidious has now consolidated power. He is free to no longer have to put on this facade of being Sheev Palpatine. He can kind of just revel in the malevolent, evil character that he truly is at heart. And it's a period of time that really doesn't get covered a lot, because what you end up having happen is everyone is aware of the fact, he makes the announcement that the Jedi have turned against them, and they tried to assassinate him, and he's been disfigured, I guess, for lack of better word, by the assassination attempt of the Jedi. And he kind of withdraws from all public-facing engagements. He becomes very reclusive. He's got Vader to carry out his will. He has Governor Tarkin to carry out a lot of his military stratagems. And he has an Imperial Council that is also in charge of running most of the day-to-day affairs of his empire. So he can just kind of sit behind the scenes and plot and plan and put stratagems into motion. And it's to the point where, the citizens start to notice that he is no longer appearing, and there's a lot of question in the minds of the populace of whether he actually had survived the assassination attempt after all. But clearly during that period of time, they've already started working on the Death Star. His long-term plan is that he wants the Death Star to be the thing that really cements his rule throughout the galaxy, but he is forced into a situation where he still needs to leave the Senate in place for approximately about 20 years, which is the amount of time it took to complete the Death Star, to keep the various systems in line and to kind of, keep there from being any revolts or uprisings. Mm-hmm. And that really turns into kind of one of the unspoken things that you never really hear about in any of the films. The rebels defeat the Death Star at the Battle of Yavin. Luke fires those proton torpedoes down the exhaust port, blows it up. Vader goes spinning off into space, and they never really talk about the Emperor's reaction to all that, but this was probably the most dangerous period of time for the Empire because, again, they've disbanded the Senate. The Death Star was supposed to be what was keeping the systems in line, under the control of the various Moffs, and all of a sudden the Death Star is no more.
Yeah, and we don't know what the Emperor was doing during that time. Like you said, he was kind of a recluse. He may have been trying to research some other things. He may have just decided, look, I'm comfortable in my place. I can do my things. I'll let my people rule over the galaxy, and I'm fine. But then once the first Death Star falls, he realizes, things aren't going the way I had put in place. Things aren't going exactly right. I need to take a bigger role in this, and that's why you start seeing him within Empire Strikes Back and, of course, Return of the Jedi.
Correct. It's generally considered that what he was doing during that time, as he kind of withdrew from the eyes of the public, was that he was really starting to try to delve into how he might be able to extend his life, ideally indefinitely. And that, again, is going to, I think, tie into our discussion with the whole return of him within the Rise of Skywalker in some way, shape, or form, because he may not have, at the time of Revenge of the Sith, uncovered all the mysteries of Plagueis in terms of how to extend his life. But he was very much interested he wanted the Galactic Empire to rule for all time, and he wanted himself at the head of that. So he was very much dedicated to trying to figure out a way to avoid his own death. And as I mentioned at the beginning, by the time you get to the Battle of Yavin, he's at about 84 years old. He's a human male. Even with his Force sensitivity, there may be some ways that he could extend his life, but certainly not to the degree that he had intended. So I'm hoping that at some point they start bringing more of that back into canon to really kind of reveal what he was up to during those years.
Yeah, I wouldn't shock me. We talked about this just recently. Actually, it was last week when we were talking about The Mandalorian and some of the other shows that are coming out for Disney Plus and such. It's interesting that they're delving into some parts of the timeline that haven't been really explored within the animated series or the films themselves. So it will be kind of nice to see if they delve into some of the stuff that was going on at that same kind of periods that we don't have a lot of information on, especially canon information.
Yeah, I certainly with the Disney Plus streaming service and what it looks like they're doing with The Mandalorian, I'm sure the Cassian Andor series is going to be just as good. There's so much material for them to draw from and so many kind of alleyways that they have not explored down that I don't think there's going to be any shortage of content for Star Wars.
No, it's like I say it every week. It's a great time to be alive as a Star Wars fan.
Indeed. So the other item, the other kind of focus that he had post the Battle of Yavin and leading up to the Battle of Endor was obviously the construction of the second Death Star. As I mentioned earlier, it took him 20 years to build the first Death Star, and certainly we're talking a much shorter period of time between the Battle of Yavin and the Battle of Endor. So they were pressing hard to get that Death Star completed. I'm sure he was also engaged in laying the groundwork for the rebels getting a hold of those plans so that he could lure them into the trap to crush the rebellion and, get his hands on Luke Skywalker, who, again, he's got Darth Vader, who at that time was the, strongest Force sensitive that he had come across other than himself. But with the injuries that he sustained and the fact that he was more machine than man, the fact that there's another Skywalker that exists that is full flesh and blood, well, minus a hand, seems to run in the family.
Yes.
And still had that, that vaunted Skywalker blood and was younger. I mean, Palpatine, once again, looking for the youngest, strongest apprentice he could get his hands on. That seemed to be another huge piece of what was occupying his time during those years. Yeah,
younger, didn't have to spend his time when he wasn't in the suit in a back-to-tank all the time, just trying to heal his wounds constantly, keep himself together. Definitely something that he needed, and obviously something that Palpatine assumed like I'm going to live much, much, much longer. I need a younger apprentice to be in this role next to me to keep me going for that many more years.
Yeah, absolutely. One interesting thing post Battle of Endor, and as we kind of get into that sequel era, something that I had not been aware of until recently was that during The Force Awakens, in the scene where Rey has the vision after she touches the Skywalker lightsaber in Maz's castle, and during the specific scene where, you know, she is kind of there watching Kylo Ren and the Knights of Ren destroying Luke's academy, just as Kylo Ren impales the warrior that's headed toward the viewpoint that Rey's looking at it from, you can actually hear Palpatine's voice in the background saying, "Any Jedi?" And apparently that came from his line to Anakin during Revenge of the Sith, as he tells him that, you know, only through Palpatine can he become more powerful than any Jedi. So this is not the first time in the sequel trilogy that we have actually had Palpatine show up in some way, shape, or form.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I know there was so much thrown into that scene, and you could pick through it numerous times and pick out little bits and pieces of information just out of that part. And what does that mean? Why is that here? What is that scene? What are we seeing here? But I don't think I've ever picked that part out. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I hadn't noticed it. Certainly not the audible portion of it. And I know that one of the ways that you can kind of pick up on a lot of things that are going on there is to turn on subtitles. But this is one of the snippets that didn't even show up in the subtitles. It wasn't until the novelization came out that this became apparent. So
interesting stuff.
Yeah, just another little tidbit. Right. So that kind of takes us to the conversation about the return of Palpatine and how that may come about within the Rise of Skywalker. And it really kind of all ties back to, while the Jedi following their death have the ability to, you know, with the appropriate training, have the ability to merge with the Force and still maintain an identity within the Force, and coming back as the blue glowies, Force Ghost, whatever you want to call them.
The blue glowies, I like that.
Right. So
would he be a red glowy?
Well, yeah, obviously the Sith, you'd expect him to be red, but that was never really the way that they approached the Sith. They didn't have that ability to merge with the Force, but what they did have the ability to do, and again, this is within Legends, so we will see if this comes back into play with current canon, but the methodology that they had to either transfer themselves into another body or into an object or link themselves to a location was called essence transfer. And we did see this with Palpatine specifically. Following the events of the Battle of Endor, there was a series of comics called Dark Empire that came out, and what happened was Palpatine had actually created clones. And following his death, he used the essence transfer to transfer himself into one of those clones and was able to then live on through that clone. And because he had so many of them, when Luke went to confront him, Palpatine revealed to Luke that I have all these clones. If you kill me, I'll just transfer myself into another one. And that was actually enough to cause Luke to despair to the point where he fell to the dark side for a brief period of time. So there was an example of a scenario within Legends that kind of dealt with Palpatine living on past the Battle of Endor and then kind of reemerging to take over the Empire again. In addition, within some of the other Star Wars Legacy novels, you do come across scenarios where certain locations have the spirits of Sith Lords that died and had their spirit linked to that particular location, again, through some form of essence transfer, Exar Kun and, you know, a number of other Sith Lords. So the question then becomes, is it going to be a scenario where Palpatine had clones and was able to transfer his essence? Is it going to be something, and I think, Tom, you had mentioned this a little bit earlier, you know, you see Rey and, you know, all the heroes of the film looking out across the ocean at the ruins of the Death Star. And the question is, are they going to encounter his spirit somehow tied to those ruins? Or, you know, it could be a Force vision. It could be any number of things. Do you have any thoughts on what you think maybe the most likely would be?
Interesting. I kind of wonder if it's going to be something, because we were just mentioning the lightsaber scene where Rey touches the lightsaber and she sees all these things go through her mind. And I wonder if it's going to be something similar along those lines, that maybe that is something where she's extra force sensitive, that she can touch certain items, and whatever the presence that was within them, the force sensitivity that is within them kind of transfers to her, and she sees flashes. And I wonder if maybe she'll go over and, as we saw in the trailer, it looked like that was the shell of the Death Star 2, that maybe she touches a part of it or touches his throne or does something, and then maybe she sees something along those lines or hears something. And then it also, it may not even be her. We assume that maybe that she's hearing this, but it could be Kylo Ren, Ben Solo. It could be a ton of different things. I was also interested when you're talking about the clone thing. The one thing that is in canon, because it was on Star Wars Battlefront 2, the video game, they have one storyline in there that's with Eden Versio, and who was with Inferno Squad. She turns over, begins fighting with the rebels at one point. But right after the fall of the Death Star, when Palpatine supposedly passes away, they're sent off to Imperial Star Destroyers, some droids that basically contain a message from Palpatine.
You wish to see me, sir?
Approach. The Emperor is dead. This messenger's presence is a great honor, one I choose to share with my daughter.
Versio, Operation Cinder is to begin at once. Resistance, rebellion, defiance. These are concepts that cannot be allowed to persist. You are but one of many tools by which these ideas shall be burned away. Heed my messenger. He shall relay you to your target.
Now, is that a real message that he recorded? Like, if you're seeing this, I'm dead. Or is that something where he's using some of his energy to put that in? They never really explained that in the video game itself, but that is a canon storyline. So something interesting to add into the situation.
Yeah, I'm not surprised you brought that up. I actually had a note about that as well. I played Battlefront. The actual beings, I guess, if you want to call them that, were the Sentinels, and really it looked. I'm sure it was some form of artificial life form, a droid or some such, and essentially the face. It looked to me like a holo projector, but I get what you're saying. It could just as easily have been, he's alive and projecting his image through them. But yeah, he called on the remaining Imperials to put into effect what he called Operation Cinder, which was essentially his revenge against the survivors of the Battle of Endor, and he wanted to scour those rebellious worlds, including his home planet of Naboo, and basically just rain destruction on them in retaliation for killing him. So certainly there is yet another example of how he kind of lived on past when we all assumed he was dead. The other thing that kind of popped into my head as we were having this discussion, and I'm surprised I didn't think about it earlier, is that he could easily have recorded a Sith holocron with his teachings in that, and that could be one of the artifacts that either Rey or Kylo or whoever comes across that, assuming they have the ability to unlock that. That could certainly be another way that he could show up in the Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah, so much to speculate on. There's so many different possibilities out there. It's going to be a fun several months here as we count down to December, trying to figure it all out until we finally get to see it on the screen.
Awesome. Yeah, and if any of the folks out there listening, if you have any ideas, theories, other additional information that you want to discuss regarding Sheev Palpatine, aka Darth Sidious, please feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email. and we'll give you that contact information at the end of the show. Really, that's going to wrap it up for the Palpatine portion of today's show. I did want to hit on a couple of news items that came across the Holonet this week, and specifically today. Tom was the first one to give me a shout out regarding this, as he got his notification as they're going to be staying there at Disneyland in one of the on-site hotels. So they're going to get that guaranteed 4-hour window, which we weren't really sure how long it was going to be that they were going to open this window for. But it certainly looks like the folks staying at one of those on-site Disneyland-owned hotels, either the Paradise Pier, Disneyland Hotel, or the Grand Californian out at Disneyland. If you have a reservation anytime from May 31st to June 23rd, you should have already gotten an email with that reservation time. It's going to be for a 4-hour period. If you received an email earlier in the day, pay careful attention, because that first email you got probably had an error in it. I know, Tom, you ran across this issue.
Yeah, my first, I was really excited when I first saw it. I'm like, oh, okay, well, we got our reservation for Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. It's going to be on Saturday, June 1st at 8 a.m. to noon. I'm like, great, okay, we're getting there that day. It seems a little weird that that's the first day we're getting there and it's first thing in the morning, but I don't care. I kind of like that. And then I scrolled down through the email more, and I look at my reservation, because they also have the hotel reservation listed on there, and it had us checking in on the 31st and checking out on the 1st. And when I made the reservation, I made it for the 1st and the 2nd, because we didn't want to have to fight. If we didn't know when they were going to schedule these reservations, we didn't want to try and figure out Friday if they booked it on Friday, trying to battle Southern California traffic to get up there in time to make this reservation. So we just decided to make it for the weekend. So then I looked on my reservation online and yes, it was still the right way. It was still the 1st to the 2nd. So I knew that there was a problem, tried to make some phone calls. They had all sorts of issues. You couldn't get through. Then I started noticing, I checked out some boards online. There were others having the same problem. So somewhere along the line, they messed up, shifted everything by 24 hours. There were some people that were receiving notices that their reservation was for the 30th of May, when Star Wars Galaxy's Edge wasn't even going to be open that day. So, obviously it became clear pretty early on that there was just a problem with the reservation system, and it took them maybe like 4 or 5 hours. They finally sent another email saying, oh, we've corrected it. Here's the real time. And so they corrected it. We're going on Sunday, 8 a.m. to noon. It just shifted by 24 hours.
Yep. So definitely make sure that if you got that email, check. You should have a follow-up email with the correct date and time. So don't panic. I know that it was all over social media, over a number of the boards. And if you did get one of those emails stating that you were going to be getting access to Star Wars Galaxy's Edge on the 30th, you did not get early access. You're going to have to calm yourselves. But yeah, it's going to be a great opportunity. I think it's really cool that they're given a 4-hour window. It should be plenty of time to get in there and experience the land. For guests that are going to be there and have a valid ticket, you're going to be able to start booking your reservation or your window starting on May 2nd of 2019. I believe the time that was given was 10 a.m. Pacific time.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. No, go ahead.
Yeah, it looked like there was also something in there, and I was trying to read through it and trying to understand it. And I'm sure more details will come out as we get over the next 2 weeks as we get closer to it. But it looked like there was something at 8 a.m. Pacific time that's like going to be some instructions going out for it. And then 10 a.m. is when the reservations are going to actually open up. I don't know if there's going to be some other things as far as different memberships, as far as annual pass holders, DVC members, whatever, D23 members. You keep an eye out for that if you're members of any of those too, because there could be something that comes along with that as well.
Right. And so this is going to be for any guests that are going to be visiting the parks from the 31st of May up until the 23rd of June that are not staying at a Disney-owned resort out there at Disneyland. Just make sure that you're aware of when those times are, and get in there. Make sure you have your Disneyland account created so that you're going to be able to get in there and make that reservation online. It's the only, from what I could tell, it was the only way you're going to be able to make it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that they've announced right now. Who knows what else will happen, but that what they've announced so far, that's it.
Correct. And the other thing that I want to point out, I know that we mentioned this before, but I don't think it can be overstated. Hopefully it helps somebody. But keep in mind that when this land opens out at Disneyland and when the land opens at Walt Disney World coming on August 29th, that you are aware that the Rise of the Resistance attraction is not going to be open. There's going to be a Phase 1 opening that should be everything other than Rise of the Resistance open and operating. But that Rise of the Resistance is going to be coming online at some point later. We will make sure that we put it out there when that information becomes available. And please make sure that you are paying attention to, when we look at these dates and where the land's opening. I would just be terrible to have someone show up at Walt Disney World on May 31st thinking you're getting into Star Wars Galaxy's Edge.
Yeah.
Gonna have a bit of a wait.
Yes, make sure you know which park we're talking about, Bambia Ted. But all you have to know is by August 29th, they'll be open on both coasts.
Exactly. So, Tom, again, I'm super excited for you. I cannot wait to hear all about it. I'll be following your Instagram. I'm sure it's going to be all over there. So,
oh yeah.
Again, do you want to go ahead and give the listeners your information for your podcast and how they can reach you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rob. You can find us. We're the Hyperion Adventures podcast. We talk about all things Disney. We also talk about Star Wars, obviously, Marvel. We talk about tips for your vacation, how to make your trips to the Walt Disney World Resort, the Disneyland Resort, a little bit smoother, Disney Cruise Line, Run Disney. We talk about it all, and you can find us pretty much anywhere you find a podcast, but especially on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. We're on SoundCloud as well. We have our own website, HyperionAdventuresPodcast.com, and we have a lot of fun on social media as well. You can find us on Twitter at Hyperion Podcast and on Facebook and Instagram at Hyperion Adventures Podcast.
Yeah, and definitely make sure you go out there and give Hyperion a listen. They've been doing a series on Star Wars Remembered that I've been guesting on, where we kind of go film by film, and we're doing them in a chronological order within the Star Wars universe. So starting with Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, we already have in the books, and we'll be doing an episode each month leading up to the release of the Rise of Skywalker. So please go out there, give it a listen, and give them a like, give them a review, and if you would please tell a friend, kind of spread the word via word of mouth and get them some extra listeners. So for us, if you want to reach us at Jedi Temple Archives Podcast, you can do so at jtapodcast@gmail.com. And on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest at JTA Podcast. And you can find this podcast pretty much any of the locations that Tom mentioned for theirs. We are on pretty much every major platform. If you like to listen to your podcast on a platform and can't find us, drop us a line and we will make sure that gets added. So, Tom, thank you once again for coming on and spending your evening with us.
Great time. Thanks again for having me, Rob. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And for the rest of you, thanks for tuning in. We look forward to talking to you next week, and may the Force be with you.